Welcome to The Explainer. So today, we are jumping into a really fascinating period in American history, a time when the world was changing so fast that thousands of people decided the only answer was to just scrap the whole thing and start over. We're talking about a time when people weren't just dreaming of a better world, they were actually trying to build it, right from the ground up. Okay, let's really get into this. Imagine for a second. You hate your job, you're fed up with society. What if you could just build a perfect world from scratch? I mean, that's the very question thousands of Americans were asking themselves between about 1820 and 1860. The country was going through this massive change, and for a lot of folks, the old ways just weren't cutting it anymore. So what do you do? So what was causing all this anxiety? Well, it really boils down to the rise of capitalism. This new market society created all this pressure and competition. It pushed a kind of individualism that left a lot of people feeling totally disconnected, alienated and just deeply unhappy with their lives. And they started to think, man, there's got to be a better way to live and work. All right, so how did people respond? Well, one way was to just leave. Some chose to leave society behind completely and go design a better one. These groups headed out into the countryside to create what they hoped would be these perfect communities, utopias, far, far away from the pressures of the new economy. And we're not talking about just a bunch of abstract dreamers here. No, these were farmers, artisans, religious idealists, people who were pushed to the brink by big economic crises like the Panic of 1837. They were searching for some stability, sure, but also for a deeper, spiritual meaning they felt was just getting lost in the race for money. They were literally drawing up blueprints for a whole new way of life.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. This chart lays out three of the most famous experiments, and you can see right away how totally different their solutions were. They all kind of agreed that private property had to go, but when it came to marriage and sex, whoa, their ideas went in completely opposite directions, from absolutely no sex at all to everyone being married to everyone else. It's wild.
So let's talk about the Shakers for a sec. They were actually one of the most successful and long-lasting groups. Their founder, Mother Ann Lee, was believed to be the second coming of Christ. And their whole society was designed to create this heaven on earth. For them, that meant giving up what they called lustful gratifications. So they were celibate, they owned everything in common, and they had this truly radical belief for the time, that God was both male and female, which led to men and women sharing leadership roles.
Then you had the Fourierists, who were coming at this from a totally different, more socialist angle. Their biggest voice in America was this guy Albert Brisbane, and he argued that capitalism wasn't just hurting workers, it was trapping women. He believed their socialist communes, which he called phalanxes, would create real gender equality because men and women would share all the labor. The whole idea was to liberate women from being stuck with endless domestic chores.
And then, wow, this just shows you how far some of these communities were willing to go. The Oneida community, led by this super charismatic guy, John Humphrey Noyes, really took things to another level. They believed that humans could become totally sinless, right here on Earth. And to do that, they completely re-engineered the family. They practiced what they called complex marriage, where every man was married to every woman. The goal was to free women from being the property of one man. And they totally embraced this new freedom. Women cut their hair short and wore pantaloons. It's incredible. And somehow, they made it work for decades by becoming amazing manufacturers of animal traps and later on that famous silverware.
Okay, so now we've got to talk about the most successful and for sure the most controversial utopian group of them all. And they took a very different path. Because while all those other groups were trying to invent some radical new future, the Mormons were looking to restore a sacred past.
So here's the thing that made the Mormons so different. Unlike the Shakers, who were all about gender equality, or the Oneidians, who completely remade marriage, the Mormons, founded by Joseph Smith, actually wanted to reinforce traditional structures. Their utopia was built around a strong patriarchal authority in these really tight-knit communities directed by the church. Their goal wasn't social revolution, it was social preservation in a world they saw as sinful and way too individualistic. And you can see on this timeline, their search for utopia wasn't just some philosophical debate, it was a brutal physical journey. Because of their tight-knit communities, their secret rituals, and their growing political power, they faced incredible hostility. They were literally driven from New York to Ohio to Missouri and then to Illinois, where their founder Joseph Smith was murdered by a mob. And that's what forced his successor, Brigham Young, to lead thousands of his followers on this epic journey outside the United States into what's now Utah. This slide, I think, does a great job of boiling it all down. You've basically got two very different utopian visions happening at the same time. On one side, you have the radicals, like the Shakers and Oneidians. They were trying to tear down the old order of gender, family, and property. But on the other side, you've got the Mormons, who were trying to perfect that old order through religious discipline, all while embracing the private property and business savvy of the very market system the other groups were trying to escape.
Okay, but what if you're not the run-for-the-hills type? What if you ran towards the chaos instead of away from it? Let's check out how a whole other group of people dove headfirst into the rapidly growing American city, and they created a completely different kind of social experiment.
I mean, just look at this number. It's staggering. In a single lifetime, New York City went from being a pretty big town to a massive metropolis of over 1 million people. This population just exploded, full of people from the countryside and immigrants from overseas, and it created this entirely new world, one that was anonymous, full of energy, and totally free from the old rules of small-town life.
And this new urban culture, it was a wild scene. You know, away from the watchful eyes of their families, young people were exploring all sorts of new freedoms. The sex trade boomed. Fashion wasn't just clothing, it was a performance out on the streets. And this loud, rowdy, vibrant entertainment culture just popped up for everybody. In its own way, the city was just as radical a challenge to the old moral order as any of those rural utopias.
And nothing captures this new urban identity better than the Bowery Boy or the Bahoy. These were working-class guys who, at night, would totally transform themselves. They had these flamboyant, very specific styles. And this wasn't just about clothes. This was a statement. It was a declaration of identity, a way of carving out a place for yourself in this massive, anonymous city. They were building a new culture from the streets up.
Now, the most popular form of entertainment was also the most complex and, frankly, disturbing. Minstrel shows were built on deeply racist caricatures of African Americans, performed by white actors in blackface. But at the same time, they were also full of social commentary. They made fun of the rich, they ridiculed new immigrants, they poked fun at the women's rights movement. For the very diverse, often immigrant audiences, these shows became a weird way of building a shared sense of white identity in this chaotic new city.
All right, so we've got these two completely different scenes, right? You have the super planned, isolated rural utopia on one hand, and the sprawling, chaotic, anonymous city on the other. I mean, on the surface, they seem like total opposites. But what did they actually have in common?
And here's what's so fascinating when you put them side by side like this. It shows that both groups were wrestling with the exact same problems. The Shakers dealt with traditional marriage by rejecting it completely with celibacy. The city responded with prostitution and new ways of dating. The women at Oneida challenged gender roles with their pantaloons. The Bowery gals did it with their own wild street fashion. Both worlds were trying to figure out these huge questions about sex, gender, family, and what it means to be a community.
So, at the end of the day, it didn't really matter if you retreated to a commune or moved to a city. You were part of a society that was just bubbling with new ideas and experiments. Both were radical attempts to figure out how to live, all driven by the fact that the old ways were breaking down. One was a very conscious, planned experiment. The other was messy and chaotic. But both were trying to answer the same fundamental question: how are we supposed to live now? And that leaves us with this huge question, one that feels just as real today as it was almost 200 years ago. When you're faced with deep, serious social problems, what's the right move? Do you pull back and try to build a perfect little model in isolation? Or do you dive right into the messy reality of it all and try to change things from the inside? It's a fundamental debate that really every generation has to answer for itself.